The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle's ancient stone corridors, as Margaret Thompson, a longtime palace archivist, carefully sorted through boxes of correspondence that had been stored away for decades. Her weathered hands moved, methodically through yellowed envelopes and faded documents, each piece telling a story of royal history. Margaret had worked at the palace for over 30 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Royal scandals, family disputes, and political tensions were nothing new to her experienced eyes. But as she reached into the bottom of an ornate wooden chest that had been discovered during recent renovations, her fingers touched something unexpected. Hidden, beneath layers of official state papers, was a cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax that bore an unusual marking. The handwriting on the front was elegant but hurried, as if written in great emotion. What caught Margaret's attention was the name written across it. For Charles, when the time is right. The signature below made her heart skip a beat. It was, signed Camilla, in the distinctive handwriting she had come to recognize over the years. But this letter was different from the usual correspondence that passed through royal channels. The paper itself was personal stationery, not the official, royal letterhead used for formal communications. The wax seal had been broken and carefully resealed, suggesting someone had read it before hiding it away. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she held the envelope up to the light. Through the thin paper, she could make out several pages of dense handwriting. Her professional instincts told her to follow protocol and report the discovery immediately to her supervisor. But something about the urgency in the handwriting made her hesitate. The archive room was quiet except for the distant sounds of palace staff going about their daily routines. Margaret looked around nervously before carefully opening the envelope. What she found inside made her sit down heavily in her chair, her face growing pale as she read the first few lines. The letter began with words that immediately revealed its explosive nature. Camilla had written about secrets that could change everything the public thought they knew about the royal family. She mentioned conversations with King Charles that had never been made public, decisions that were made in private that affected the entire monarchy, and revelations about other family members that were shocking in their honesty. As Margaret continued reading, she realized she was holding something that could shake the very foundations of the British royal family. The letter contained Camilla's true feelings about her role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, details about private family meetings where crucial decisions were made, and most surprisingly, her candid opinions about other members of the royal family that painted them in a very different light than their public image. One particular passage made Margaret's blood run cold. Camilla had written about a conversation she overheard between senior royals discussing how to handle the Diana situation in the months before the princess's tragic death. The words suggested that certain family members were more concerned about protecting the monarchy's reputation than supporting Diana during her most difficult times. But perhaps most shocking of all were Camilla's admissions about her own actions and motivations. She wrote about moments of guilt and regret, about times when she questioned whether her love for Charles was worth the pain it caused others. She revealed private conversations where Charles expressed doubts about his future as king and worried about the damage their relationship had done to the royal family's standing with the public. The letter also contained details about disagreements within the family that had never been reported. Camilla described heated arguments between Charles and his father about duty versus personal happiness. She wrote about tense encounters with other family members who blamed her for the family's troubles and made it clear they would never fully accept her. Margaret realized that this was not just a love letter or a simple personal correspondence. This was a confession, a detailed account of events and feelings that Camilla had never intended for public consumption. The raw emotion in her words and the intimate details she shared suggested this was written during a moment of intense personal crisis. As she finished reading the letter, Margaret noticed something else that made the situation even more complicated. At the bottom of the final page, there was a date that placed the letter's writing during a particularly sensitive time in royal history. It was written just months before Queen Elizabeth's death, when the family was dealing with multiple crises, and public scrutiny was at its highest. The implications of the letter's contents were staggering. If made public, it could destroy carefully crafted public images, reveal the true dynamics within the royal family, and potentially even threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. Margaret understood that she was holding dynamite in her hands. She carefully placed the letter back in its envelope and sat in the quiet archive room, her mind racing with the weight of her discovery. Her professional duty was clear, but the personal consequences for everyone involved would be devastating. The royal family had worked for decades to rebuild their image after the tumultuous events of the 1990s, and this letter could undo all of that progress in an instant. Margaret looked at her watch and realized that other staff members would soon be arriving for the day. She needed to make a decision quickly about what to do with her explosive discovery. The letter was now her burden to bear, and whatever choice she made would have consequences that rippled far beyond the palace walls. As footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, Margaret quickly secured the letter in her desk drawer. She would need time to think about her next move carefully. Little did she know that her discovery would soon set in motion a chain of events that would rock the very foundation of the British monarchy and change the royal family forever. Margaret Thompson barely slept that night. The letter's contents kept replaying in her mind like a broken record, each revelation more troubling than the last. She tossed and turned in her small apartment near the palace, weighing her options as the hours ticked by. By morning, dark circles under her eyes revealed the torment she had endured. Her first instinct was to seek advice from someone she trusted, but Margaret quickly realized how impossible that was. The letter's contents were so sensitive that sharing them with anyone could be seen as a betrayal of the royal family she had served faithfully for 3 decades. Yet keeping such explosive information to herself felt like an equally heavy burden. As she prepared for another day at the palace, Margaret's hands shook as she buttoned her uniform. She had always prided herself on her professionalism and discretion, qualities that had earned her the trust of senior palace officials over the years. But this discovery tested every principle she held dear about loyalty, duty, and doing what was right. The morning briefing with her supervisor, James Crawford, felt different than usual. James was a stern man in his 50s who had worked his way up through the palace hierarchy. He prided himself on knowing everything that happened within the royal household, and Margaret wondered if he somehow sensed that she was hiding something significant. "You look tired, Margaret," James observed as they reviewed the day's archival tasks. "Is everything all right?" Margaret forced a smile and nodded, but internally she was screaming. How could she explain that she had stumbled upon information that could destroy the reputation of the woman who had recently become their queen consort? How could she admit that she now knew secrets that were never meant to see the light of day? As the morning progressed, Margaret found herself studying the faces of her colleagues differently. Sarah, the young assistant who had just started working in the archives, chatted excitedly about the upcoming royal engagements. David, the security liaison who regularly checked on the archive rooms, seemed more watchful than usual. Were they all just going about their normal routines, or did someone suspect what she had discovered? The weight of the secret became even heavier when Margaret received word that Queen Camilla herself would be visiting the archives later that week. The queen consort had taken a personal interest in preserving royal history and occasionally toured the facilities to see the work being done. The thought of facing Camilla while knowing the contents of her private letter made Margaret feel physically ill. During her lunch break, Margaret walked through the palace gardens, trying to clear her head and think rationally about her situation. She watched tourists taking photos through the palace gates, completely unaware of the drama unfolding inside. These people looked up to the royal family, saw them as symbols of stability and tradition. What would happen to their faith if the letter's contents became public? As she sat on a bench hidden from public view, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Emma, who lived in London and worked as a journalist for a respected newspaper. The irony was not lost on her. Emma had often joked about how her mother had access to the most boring job in the world, filing away dusty old papers that nobody cared about. If only Emma knew what her mother was currently grappling with. The thought of Emma brought another layer of complexity to Margaret's dilemma. Her daughter had built her career on uncovering the truth and holding powerful people accountable. Emma had won awards for her investigative reporting, and had always taught her mother that transparency was essential for a healthy democracy. But this situation was different. This wasn't about exposing corruption or abuse of power. This was about private pain and personal confessions that were never meant to be shared. Margaret's afternoon was interrupted by an unexpected visit from Lord Pemberton, one of the senior advisors to King Charles. His presence in the archives was unusual, and Margaret felt her heart racing as he approached her desk with a serious expression on his face. "Margaret, I trust you understand the sensitive nature of the materials you work with here," Lord Pemberton said, his voice carrying an undertone of warning. "We've had some concerns raised about security protocols in the archives. I wanted to personally remind you that anything you encounter in your work here is strictly confidential." Margaret nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, sir. I've always maintained the highest standards of confidentiality." "I'm sure you have," Lord Pemberton replied, but his eyes seemed to study her face intently. "However, with recent renovations and the discovery of previously archived materials, we want to ensure that proper procedures are followed. Any unusual findings should be reported immediately through official channels." After he left, Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Was this conversation a coincidence, or did someone suspect that she had found something significant? The timing seemed too perfect to be random. Perhaps there were security cameras in the archives that she wasn't aware of, or maybe someone had noticed her unusual behavior. That evening, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of going straight home, she drove to a small church on the outskirts of Windsor where she had attended services since childhood. Father Mackenzie, the elderly priest who had been her confidant for years, welcomed her into his small office behind the sanctuary. "I can see something is troubling you deeply, my child," Father Mackenzie said gently. "Would you like to talk about it?" For a moment, Margaret considered telling him everything. The sanctity of confession would protect her secrets, and the priest had always offered wise counsel during difficult times in her life. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she realized that even this sacred space couldn't fully protect the information she carried. The letter's contents were too explosive, too dangerous to share with anyone. "I'm facing a situation where doing the right thing might cause great harm to people I care about," Margaret said carefully. "But staying silent feels like a betrayal of everything I believe in." Father Mackenzie leaned back in his chair, understanding the weight of her words, even without knowing the specific details. "Sometimes, my dear Margaret, the greatest act of love is knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Prayer and reflection will guide you to the right choice, but remember that some burdens are too heavy for one person to carry alone." As Margaret left the church that night, she realized that her decision could not be delayed much longer. The letter was like a ticking time bomb, and every day she kept it hidden increased the risk of it being discovered by others who might not handle it with the same care and discretion. The royal family was already facing numerous challenges, with public opinion polls showing declining support for the monarchy among younger generations. The revelation of Camilla's letter could be the final straw that pushed public sentiment over the edge. Yet Margaret also understood that the truth had a way of eventually surfacing, regardless of how well it was buried. That night, as she finally fell into a troubled sleep, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She would need to find a way to return the letter to its rightful owner, without revealing that she had read its contents. But little did she know that her attempts to protect the royal family would actually set in motion the very events she was trying to prevent. Margaret's plan to discreetly return the letter without revealing its contents quickly unraveled when she arrived at work the next morning, to find her archive room in chaos. Security personnel were carefully examining every box, every drawer, and every filing cabinet under the supervision of Lord Pemberton and a woman Margaret didn't recognize. "Ah, Margaret," Lord Pemberton said as she stood frozen in the doorway. "This is Detective Inspector Sarah Mills from the Metropolitan Police. We've had reports of some sensitive materials that may have gone missing from the archives." Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The letter was still locked in her desk drawer, and she watched helplessly as Detective Inspector Mills approached that very piece of furniture. There was no way to retrieve it now, without revealing that she had been hiding something significant. I'll need to examine your desk as well, Detective Inspector Mills said politely but firmly. This is purely routine, but we need to be thorough. As the detective opened Margaret's drawer, her trained eyes immediately spotted the cream-colored envelope that looked distinctly different from the usual archive materials. She lifted it carefully, noting the broken wax seal and the elegant handwriting. "What's this?" she asked, holding the envelope up to the light just as Margaret had done days earlier. Margaret's mouth went dry. I found it yesterday during my cataloging work. I was planning to report it through proper channels, but I wanted to verify its contents first." Lord Pemberton's face darkened as he recognized the handwriting on the envelope. "Give me that immediately," he demanded, reaching for the letter. But Detective Inspector Mills held it firmly. "I'm afraid this is now part of our investigation. If this document is as sensitive as you seem to think it is, then it needs to be handled through official police channels. What happened next would be talked about in royal circles for years to come." As Detective Inspector Mills opened the envelope and began reading the first page, her expression changed dramatically. She looked up at Lord Pemberton with barely concealed shock. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "I need to contact my superior immediately." Lord Pemberton made several frantic phone calls over the next hour, speaking in hushed tones with what Margaret assumed were senior palace officials and legal advisors. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Mills carefully photographed each page of the letter, documenting it as evidence before sealing it in an official evidence bag. Margaret was escorted to a small conference room where she was questioned extensively about how she had found the letter and who else might have had access to it. She answered truthfully, explaining that she had discovered it during routine archival work and had not shared its contents with anyone. "Did you read the entire letter?" Detective Inspector Mills asked. Margaret hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I did. I thought it was important to understand what I had found. And what was your impression of its contents?" "They were highly personal and potentially damaging to several members of the royal family," Margaret admitted. By mid-afternoon, news of the police investigation at Windsor Castle had leaked to the press. Reporters began gathering outside the palace gates, sensing that something significant was happening. Palace officials worked frantically to contain the situation, but Margaret could see through the conference room window that their efforts were failing. The first news alert appeared on television. Around 3 o'clock. Police investigation underway at Windsor Castle. Sensitive documents discovered. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media and international news outlets. Margaret watched in horror as speculation ran wild about what the discovered documents might contain. Some reports suggested they were related to financial improprieties. Others claimed they involved national security issues. And a few bold journalists theorized they might be personal correspondence that could embarrass the royal family. As evening approached, Margaret was finally allowed to return home, but not before being warned that she might be called as a witness if the matter proceeded to formal legal proceedings. The weight of what she had set in motion was almost unbearable. Her daughter, Emma, called within minutes of Margaret arriving home. As a journalist, Emma had been following the breaking news story and was shocked to learn that her mother was at the center of it all. "Mum, what exactly did you find?" Emma asked, her professional instincts kicking in. "I can't discuss it, Emma. I've been warned about confidentiality and there are legal implications now," Margaret replied wearily. But Emma was persistent. "This is huge, Mum. The entire country is talking about it. If you found something that important, the public has a right to know what it is." This conversation crystallized the conflict that Margaret had been struggling with since her discovery. Her daughter represented one viewpoint, that transparency and accountability were essential, especially when it came to public figures. But Margaret also understood the human cost of revelation, the real people who would be hurt if Camilla's private thoughts and confessions became public knowledge. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, emergency meetings were being held at the highest levels. King Charles had been informed of the letter's discovery and was reportedly devastated by the breach of his wife's privacy. Queen Camilla herself was said to be in seclusion, too distraught to carry out her scheduled public engagements. The palace's Initial strategy was to claim that the letter was a forgery, or that its contents had been taken out of context. But handwriting experts were already being called in by the media, and Detective Inspector Mills had confirmed that the paper and ink were consistent with the time period when the letter was supposedly written. By late evening, the first excerpts from the letter began appearing in newspapers. Someone within the police investigation had leaked portions of the content, and the revelations were every bit as explosive as Margaret had feared they would be. The leaked excerpts included Camilla's admission that she had encouraged Charles to be more assertive with his family about their relationship, even when it caused pain to others. She wrote about feeling guilty for her role in the breakdown of his first marriage, but believing that true love should triumph over duty and tradition. More damaging were her candid assessments of other family members. She described certain royals as being more concerned with their public image than with genuine service to the country. She questioned whether the monarchy as an institution could survive in the modern world, and worried that their personal scandals were undermining its foundations. D2. Public reaction was swift and divided. Some people expressed sympathy for Camilla, seeing her as a woman who had been honest about her struggles and emotions. Others were outraged by what they saw as callousness and selfishness, particularly regarding her role in Charles and Diana's marriage troubles. Social media exploded with hashtags both defending and condemning the Queen Consort. We Stand with Camilla trended alongside Camillagate and Royal Truth. The monarchy's approval ratings, which had been slowly recovering in recent years, plummeted overnight. As Margaret watched the news coverage from her living room, she realized that her simple act of discovery had unleashed forces that were now completely beyond her control. The letter that Camilla had written as a private confession was now being dissected and analyzed by millions of people around the world. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, and it would emerge from an unexpected source that would shake the very foundations of everything people thought they knew about the royal family's recent history. The revelation that would change everything came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a retired palace physician who had served the royal family for over 40 years, watched the news coverage of the letter scandal from her quiet cottage in the Cotswolds and knew she could no longer remain silent. Dr. Hartwell had been the royal family's trusted medical advisor during some of their most difficult periods. She had treated them not just as patients, but had often served as a confidential counselor during personal crises. Her loyalty to the family had been absolute, but the public discussion of Camilla's letter had awakened her conscience about secrets she had been keeping for decades. At 82 years old, Dr. Hartwell had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain by finally telling the truth. She had watched Margaret Thompson being vilified in the media for discovering the letter, and she knew that the real story was far more complex than anyone understood. The morning after the letter excerpts were published, Dr. Hartwell made a phone call that would send shockwaves through the establishment. She contacted investigative journalist Michael Patterson, known for his careful and thorough reporting on royal affairs, and told him she had information that would put the letter scandal into an entirely different context. What I'm about to tell you will change everything people think they know about the royal family's recent history, Dr. Hartwell said during their first conversation. But I need assurances that my medical records and evidence will be handled properly. Michael Patterson had been covering the royal beat for 15 years and had never heard such conviction in a source's voice. Dr. Hartwell's reputation was impeccable, and her decision to come forward carried enormous weight. They arranged to meet at her cottage the following day. What Dr. Hartwell revealed during that meeting was staggering in its implications. She explained that Camilla's letter had not been written as a simple confession or emotional outpouring. Instead, it was part of a carefully orchestrated plan that involved several senior members of the royal household and had been designed to reshape the monarchy's future. According to Dr. Hartwell, the letter was written during a period when Queen Elizabeth's health was declining rapidly, though this was being kept secret from the public. Senior royals and palace officials were deeply concerned about how the transition to Charles's reign would be received, especially given the continued negative public perception of Camilla. They needed a way to humanize Camilla and generate sympathy. For her, Dr. Hartwell explained to Patterson, The letter was never meant to remain secret forever. It was written with the intention that it would eventually be discovered and would show Camilla as a vulnerable, honest woman who had struggled with difficult choices. But the plan had gone far beyond just writing a letter. Dr. Hartwell revealed that she had been present during several meetings where palace officials and senior royals discussed how to manage the monarchy's image during the transition period. These meetings included discussions about manufactured controversies and strategic leaks that could actually strengthen their position by generating public sympathy. The most shocking revelation was that Margaret Thompson had not discovered the letter by accident. Dr. Hartwell had medical records showing that Margaret had been under significant financial pressure due to her husband's medical bills, and palace officials had been aware of this vulnerability. The letter had been deliberately placed where Margaret would find it, with the expectation that her desperation might lead her to leak its contents for money. They underestimated Margaret's integrity, Dr. Hartwell admitted. She didn't sell the story to tabloids as they expected. Instead, she tried to handle it professionally, which actually made the eventual revelation more credible and damaging than they had planned. Patterson spent 3 days verifying Dr. Hartwell's claims through independent sources and documentary evidence. The medical records she provided showed the royal family's health issues that had been kept secret. Phone records confirmed meetings and conversations that supported her timeline. Most damning of all, she had kept copies of memos and correspondence that outlined the strategic communications plan. When Patterson's story broke, it sent shockwaves through the British establishment that made the original letter scandal look like a minor controversy. The headline read, "The Royal Setup: How Palace Officials Orchestrated the Camilla Letter Scandal to Manipulate Public Opinion." The article revealed that several senior palace officials, including Lord Pemberton, had been part of the conspiracy to use the letter as a tool for reputation management. They had calculated that a controlled scandal that showed Camilla's vulnerability would be preferable to the continued erosion of public support for the monarchy. The plan had included provisions for how to handle the letter's discovery, including having police involvement to add credibility and having strategic leaks to the media to control the narrative. What they hadn't anticipated was Dr. Hartwell's decision to reveal the truth behind their manipulation. The public reaction to Patterson's revelations was unprecedented. Protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, with crowds demanding transparency and accountability from the royal family. The hashtag #YarnRoyalLies began trending worldwide, and Republican sentiment reached levels not seen since the aftermath of Princess Diana's death. Margaret Thompson, who had been portrayed as either a villain or a victim in the original story, was now revealed as an unwitting pawn in a much larger game. The public's sympathy shifted dramatically in her favor, and she received thousands of messages of support from people who admired her integrity in trying to handle the situation responsibly. But the most significant impact was on the royal family itself. King Charles was reportedly furious that such a plan had been carried out without his knowledge or consent. Palace sources suggested that he had been kept in the dark about the letter's strategic placement and had genuinely believed that its discovery was accidental. Queen Camilla's position became even more precarious. While some people sympathized with her as another victim of palace manipulation, others questioned whether she had been complicit in the plan to use her own private thoughts as propaganda. The authenticity of the emotions expressed in the letter was now in doubt, even though handwriting and forensic analysis confirmed it was genuinely written by her. Lord Pemberton and several other senior palace officials were forced to resign, in disgrace. The Metropolitan Police opened a formal investigation into potential fraud and conspiracy charges related to the manipulation of evidence and public deception. Detective Inspector Mills, who had been investigating the original letter discovery, found herself at the center of a much larger corruption inquiry. The constitutional implications were enormous. Members of Parliament began calling for a formal inquiry into the royal household's operations and oversight. Some suggested that the monarchy's funding should be reviewed if palace officials were using public resources to manipulate public opinion through manufactured scandals. International reaction was equally severe. Republican movements in other Commonwealth countries pointed to the scandal as evidence that monarchical institutions were inherently corrupt and manipulative. Several countries began discussing whether to remove the British monarch as their head of state. For Dr. Hartwell, the decision to come forward had been vindicated, but she took no pleasure in the chaos that followed. In interviews, she explained that her conscience had been troubled for too long by the deception she had witnessed, and she hoped that truth would ultimately strengthen rather than destroy the monarchy. "Institutions can only survive if they're built on honesty and trust," she said in one interview. "The royal family needs to earn back that trust through transparency, not through manipulation and staged controversies." As the scandal continued to unfold, it became clear that the discovery of Camilla's letter had been just the beginning of a much larger reckoning with the royal family's relationship with truth and public accountability. The question now was whether the monarchy could survive the complete exposure of its behind-the-scenes manipulation and emerge as a more honest and trustworthy institution. The emergency session of Parliament was called on a grey Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Dr. Hartwell's explosive revelations had torn through the British establishment like a hurricane. The ancient halls of Westminster had seen many constitutional crises over the centuries, but none quite like this one, where the very credibility of the monarchy was being dissected under the harsh lights of public scrutiny. Prime Minister Rebecca Foster found herself in an impossible position. As head of government, she was constitutionally bound to advise and support the monarchy. But as an elected representative of the people, she was under enormous pressure to hold the royal family accountable for what many were calling the greatest deception in modern royal history. The debate was fierce and emotional. Opposition leader Thomas Mitchell stood before a packed House of Commons and delivered what many would later describe as one of the most damning speeches against the monarchy in parliamentary history. "We are not here to discuss a simple family scandal or personal indiscretion," Mitchell declared, his voice carrying the weight of public outrage. "We are here to address a systematic campaign of deception that has used public resources, manipulated public opinion, and treated the British people as pawns in an elaborate game of reputation management." The evidence that had emerged since Dr. Hartwell's revelations painted a picture of an institution that had lost touch with its fundamental purpose. Internal palace emails, obtained through legal discovery, showed detailed discussions about how to manufacture sympathy for Queen Camilla through carefully orchestrated scandals. One particularly damaging email from a senior communications advisor read, "The public needs to see Camilla as vulnerable and human, not as the calculating woman who broke up their fairy tale prince and princess. A private letter that shows her emotional struggles could be exactly what we need to turn public opinion." Margaret Thompson had been called to testify before a parliamentary committee, where she described in detail how she had been approached by palace officials about her financial difficulties months before she discovered the letter. While no one directly asked her to leak information, the implication was clear that her desperation had been noted and potentially exploited. "I felt like I was being watched and evaluated," Margaret told the committee. "Now I understand why. They were waiting to see if I would do what they expected, sell the story for money to help with my husband's medical bills." The revelation that Margaret's integrity had actually disrupted their carefully laid plans added another layer of irony to the scandal. The palace officials had underestimated both her character and the public's ability to see through manufactured controversy. King Charles's response to the crisis became a defining moment of his reign. Against the advice of his remaining advisors, he made the unprecedented decision to address the nation directly in a televised speech from Windsor Castle. No monarch in modern history had ever made such a personal and vulnerable public statement. "Stand before you tonight not as your king, but as a man who has failed in his duty to be honest with the people he serves," Charles began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I was not aware of the deception that was carried out in my name and in the name of the crown, but that ignorance does not absolve me of responsibility." The speech was watched by over 40 million people in Britain alone, and hundreds of millions worldwide. Charles's admission of institutional failure and his promise of complete transparency represented a dramatic break from centuries of royal tradition of never explaining or apologizing for their actions. "The crown has always depended on the trust and respect of the British people," Charles continued. "That trust has been broken, not through malicious intent, but through misguided attempts to protect an institution that should need no protection, if it serves its people honorably. Most shocking of all was Charles's announcement that he was implementing immediate reforms to make the royal household completely transparent in its operations. All palace communications, financial records, and decision-making processes would be subject to independent oversight. He also announced that Queen Camilla had voluntarily agreed to step back from all public duties, pending a complete investigation. The public reaction to Charles's speech was complex and divided. Many people appreciated his honesty and willingness to take responsibility, but others felt that the damage to the monarchy's credibility was irreparable. Polls showed that support for the monarchy had dropped to its lowest levels since records began, but there was also grudging respect for Charles's handling of the crisis. Queen Camilla's withdrawal from public life became one of the most watched stories in modern royal history. Photographs of her leaving Windsor Castle in a simple black car, without the usual royal protocol and ceremony, symbolized how dramatically the scandal had changed everything. In a statement released through her lawyer, Camilla expressed deep regret for the pain caused by the revelation of her private thoughts and the subsequent manipulation of those thoughts by palace officials. She announced her intention to focus on charitable work away from the public eye and to cooperate fully with all investigations. The letter that had started it all was now housed in the National Archives, where it served as a historical document of a constitutional crisis, rather than the private confession it was originally intended to be. Historians and constitutional experts studied every word, analyzing not just its content, but its role in exposing the deep problems within the modern monarchy. Dr. Hartwell, now recognized as the whistleblower who had saved British democracy from systematic deception, used her newfound platform to call for broader reforms across all government institutions. In interviews, she emphasized that the royal scandal was likely just the tip of the iceberg when it came to official manipulation of public opinion. This isn't just about the royal family, she warned. This is about a culture of deception that has infected our institutions at the highest levels. We need to demand transparency and accountability from everyone who serves the public, whether they wear a crown or carry a government ID card. The international implications of the scandal continued to reverberate. Australia announced a referendum on becoming a republic, with polls showing unprecedented support for cutting ties with the British monarchy. Canada began formal discussions about constitutional changes, and several Caribbean nations moved forward with plans to remove the British monarch as their head of state. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the British people themselves. The scandal had forced a national conversation about democracy, accountability, and the role of traditional institutions in modern society. Town halls and community centers hosted heated debates about whether the monarchy should be reformed or abolished entirely. Margaret Thompson, who had never sought the spotlight, found herself reluctantly becoming a symbol of ordinary people standing up to powerful institutions. She returned to her work at the Palace Archives, but now her role included overseeing the new transparency initiatives that Charles had promised. In quiet moments, Margaret sometimes reflected on how a simple discovery, during routine archival work, had changed the course of British history. The letter that Camilla had written in a moment of private anguish had exposed not just personal secrets, but institutional rot that had been growing in darkness for years. As the scandal moved into its second month, it became clear that there would be no returning to the way things had been. The monarchy would either emerge from this crisis as a more honest and accountable institution, or it would face an uncertain future that could threaten its very existence. 6 months after Margaret Thompson first discovered the letter that changed everything, the British monarchy looked completely different from the institution it had been. The transformation was so dramatic that constitutional scholars were calling it the most significant reform of the crown since the English Civil War. King Charles had kept his promise of complete transparency, with a determination that surprised even his harshest critics. The new Royal Accountability Office, staffed by independent civil servants and overseen by Parliament, now monitored every aspect of royal operations. Financial records, correspondence, and decision-making processes that had been secret for centuries were now available for public scrutiny. The changes went far beyond administrative reforms. Charles had voluntarily reduced the size of the royal family's official duties and cut the civil list payments by 30%. Several royal residences were open to the public year-round, with the proceeds going directly to charitable causes. Most symbolically, the royal family now published annual reports detailing their activities, expenses, and charitable impact, just like any public institution. Margaret Thompson had become an unlikely celebrity, though she remained uncomfortable with the attention. Her integrity during the crisis had made her a symbol of honest public service, and she received hundreds of letters from people around the world thanking her for her courage. The British government had awarded her the Order of the British Empire for her service to constitutional democracy. She still worked in the palace archives, but her role had expanded significantly. As the head of the new Transparency Initiative, Margaret oversaw the process of making historical royal documents available to researchers and the public. The work was challenging but deeply meaningful, and she felt proud that her discovery had ultimately led to positive change. Dr. Hartwell had spent her final months becoming an advocate for institutional reform across government. Her testimony before parliamentary committees had led to new oversight mechanisms for several government departments. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning, knowing that her decision to speak truth to power had made a lasting difference. Queen. Camilla's journey back to public acceptance had been slow and difficult. After months of seclusion and private reflection, she began a careful return to public life focused entirely on charitable work. Her first public appearance was at a homeless shelter in London, where she worked alongside volunteers without any media fanfare or royal protocol. The letter that had caused so much controversy was now displayed in a special exhibition at the British Museum, alongside documentation of the scandal and its aftermath. Visitors could read Camilla's original words about her struggles and pain, but they could also see the evidence of how those words had been manipulated for political purposes. The exhibition had become one of the museum's most popular attractions, drawing people from around the world who wanted to understand how a single document had triggered such massive constitutional change. School groups regularly visited to learn about transparency, accountability, and the importance of questioning authority. Public opinion polls showed a remarkable transformation in how people viewed the monarchy. While support for the institution had initially plummeted during the scandal, the royal family's commitment to genuine reform had gradually rebuilt public trust. Charles's approval ratings were actually higher than they had been before the crisis, though Camilla's remained more mixed. The international impact had been equally significant but varied. Australia's referendum on becoming a republic had failed, narrowly, with many voters deciding that the monarchy's reforms deserved a chance to prove themselves. Canada had postponed its constitutional discussions, while several Caribbean nations had proceeded with their plans for independence. The broader political implications had rippled through British society in unexpected ways. The royal scandal had inspired demands for transparency in other institutions, leading to reforms in Parliament, the civil service, and even private corporations. The phrase post-letter Britain entered common usage to describe a society that was more skeptical of authority and more demanding of accountability. Michael Patterson, the journalist who had broken the story about the palace conspiracy, had won multiple awards for his reporting. But he often reflected on the human cost of the revelations. Real people had been hurt by the exposure of their private pain and manipulation, even if the ultimate result had been positive for democratic accountability. Lord Pemberton and the other officials involved in the conspiracy had faced both criminal charges and civil lawsuits. Some had been sentenced to prison terms for fraud and conspiracy to deceive the public. Others had agreed to plea bargains that included substantial financial penalties and lifetime bans from public service. The legal proceedings had established important precedents about the accountability of public institutions and the rights of citizens to accurate information from their government. Law schools now taught courses on the Camilla letter case, as an example of how personal privacy rights balanced against public transparency needs. Emma Thompson, Margaret's journalist daughter, had written a book about her mother's experience that became an international bestseller. The archivist's dilemma explored the ethical challenges faced by ordinary people who discover extraordinary secrets and the courage required to do the right thing, even when the consequences are uncertain. The book's success had allowed Margaret to pay off her husband's medical debts and secure his continued treatment at a private facility. The irony was not lost on her that the very financial pressures that palace officials had tried to exploit had ultimately been resolved through her unwavering integrity. As Margaret sat in her renovated archive office on the anniversary of her discovery, she reflected on how one morning's work had changed not just her life but the entire constitutional framework of her country. The letter that had once seemed like a burden too heavy to bear had become the catalyst for reforms that made Britain a more transparent and accountable democracy. The royal family continued their work under the new system of oversight and transparency. King Charles had adapted to the changes better than anyone expected, often saying in private that the reforms had freed him from the burden of maintaining artificial perfection. He could now focus on genuine service rather than image management. Queen Camilla's rehabilitation remained a work in progress. Her charitable efforts had genuinely impressed many people, and her willingness to subject herself to public scrutiny had gradually earned respect even from former critics. The woman who had once been seen as manipulative and calculating was now viewed by many as someone who had been manipulated herself. The letter itself, now preserved behind protective glass in the museum, continued to draw visitors who marveled at how such a personal document had triggered such massive change. The handwriting that had once seemed desperate and emotional now appeared prophetic, as if Camilla had somehow known that her private thoughts would eventually reshape the very institution she had married into. Margaret often visited the museum exhibition, not out of pride in her role, but out of amazement at how truth had a way of surfacing despite everyone's best efforts to control it. She had learned that integrity was not about making perfect choices, but about choosing honesty even when the consequences were uncertain and potentially devastating. The story of the letter had become a modern parable about power, truth, and the courage of ordinary people to hold extraordinary institutions accountable. It proved that in a democracy, no one, not even royalty, was above the obligation to be honest with the people they served. As the constitutional reforms continued to evolve and strengthen, many historians believed that the discovery of Queen Camilla's hidden letter would ultimately be remembered not as a scandal that weakened the monarchy, but as the moment when the British royal family finally learned to trust their people with the truth.